see all the enthusiasm and the guest here tonight for our presenter. John Simmons is our presenter. He now lives in the Aldo area, but he's originally from Scotts, Michigan, Scotts and Climax. And he grew up on a street where the Grand Trunk Western came through there, and he's the 8th generation on that street, so he's seen a lot of trains. He has, that's where his interest in railroads came through. And so with that being said, I'd like to introduce John Simmons, our presenter, and he's going to talk about railroads. Thanks, Dan. Sorry, my computer reset just before we got started. Jeannie's not here tonight, one of you remember?
No, she's not.
And Jeannie is really special. I was involved in learning about, always had a lifelong interest in Native Americans and the Indian Trails, which is a big part of where I grew up. Spending my summers at Indian Lake down in Kalamazoo County, which was part of the old Nottawassippi Potawatomi Reservation. So kind of is in my heritage. My cousins were Potawatomi, so had a big interest in that. So reaching out through the network, through the Tri-River, talking to different people, I come across Jeannie, and not everybody is the most open and the most sharing, and Jeannie was unbelievable. We met here in town. She brought all kinds of stuff. She let me borrow things and copy things and bring them back when you're done. She had maps that she showed me, and little Johnny got so excited, and she let me actually get a copy. So I went to the printer here in Portland where they had the file, and I made a copy of what Jeannie put this together, which is just awesome. Well, this is ridiculous. Yeah, it was fine until, like, you know, when you could see it shut down right before it came up.
This happened here last time.
I know it. I had it working. It'll come. So one of the points that I'll be talking about is right now in our communities we have a movement called Rails to Trails. And it's across all of Michigan. It affects all of our communities. And the important thing to that is that we've lost so much of our rail system. And the younger generations aren't even old enough to remember that we had rails. You know, it's so long ago. So, and that's really sad. But the part that we have forgot is that many of those trail lines used to be the Indian trails. And we went from Indian trails to the railroads. Now, how could that happen? Well, it was a case of the fact that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Native Americans walked the land, and they knew the topography. They learned where the ridges were, they knew where the swamps were, and they figured out the best lines to travel. So those lines existed when our early settlers came. And so when they started to do the railroads, oh, perfect. So when they started to do the railroads, you know, we had a jump start on the topography. Perfect. All right. Hopefully. Has anyone ever been to my presentations? I've been at like Odessa and other places. So at times I move quick, all right, because it's kind of like a movie. You don't have to study everything I throw up here because I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. And as I said, I'm going to start out here with, let's go back just a little bit, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about the Indian trails, you know, the major trails. And Portland really was part of that. And you'll see that on Jeannie's map, how the trail comes up through Portland. It was intersections of travel because of the water. I mean, this could be Grand Ledge where people are moving across. And the first native people used these, but also the first white settlers coming to this area. These are the trails they had. The water is so important, you know, with the junction of two rivers, lots of trade here. And also the portage system. And people don't think about this, but the portage from the Grand River up into the Saginaw Bay area, you go up the Maple, you can cross over there. It's an important crossing between the state, very important in the early days, but there was another portage. If you go down the Grand, you can cross over down by Jackson, you can get into the upper Huron, from there you can get down to Monroe. So again, you have a lot of traffic. Early trade was going this way, and they would pack across these portages. Of course, with the French, you start to see trade here. You start to see the trade coming out of Mackinac. You would have seen that here. In fact, we have the stories about the apple fields in your community when the early settlers come, apple fields. Now those apples are not native to Michigan. Those were brought from Europe. So you have a legacy there of history that we had French here before we had recordings. We don't know what Frenchman was here, but we know we had French traders out of Mackinac that were here in the Portland area. Rix Robinson's famous. Ada claims him. And he was part of the American Fur Company, which was, of course, the largest corporation in America at that time. Campaw, you hear about him. He's the Grand Rapids person, Campaw Square downtown. But here in Portland, the Lyons area, we had Francis Bailey. Francis Bailey was in this area. He was a mega trader with 20 posts. We know that the French were all over this area, and we're talking at that pre-settlement period. And you had the Newman family coming to Portland. This is about the level of where they would have been living when they first come to Portland. And Mary Newman being the first white child born here. Those, after the roads are starting to be opened up, you can see stagecoaches coming here, and we're predating the railroad. But the story of the railroad, if you look at the depot, and we're going to talk about the depot in Portland, it was a wooden building. It was here for a while, and wooden buildings go away. That's the story of the building. What I want to talk about is the story of the people, and how that depot affected lives, it affected your community, and it's a story of the lives of the people, our ancestors. And this is true from my hometown too, so I relate to it very closely. But the early stages, a lot of them would travel on these corduroy roads where they would cut the logs to get through the swamps, to give you some support. Very common here in Michigan, coming out of Detroit up to Lansing, trying to get into the interior. It was a rough trip by wagon. So again, this sets the stage. If you're that generation that lived here when that rail came to town, that was a big deal, because that was a rough trip. Steamboat area, you know, we don't think about that, but you know, Portland, you are close to steamboat here. And the Grand River was a steamboat, very heavy for cargo and for transportation. This is a billboard out of the Grand Rapids area, but the travel came up to Lyon. Lyon was the headwater. You couldn't go past Lyon because of the water levels. So if you wanted to catch a steamboat or ship freight out, you get it down to Lyons, they could put it on a steamboat, and it would move downriver. Examples, here's the Daniel Ball. The Ball brothers were big in the quarry business, the plaster business in Grand Rapids. Jennison boys, we have Jennison, Michigan. Jennisons were big in milling and flour. This is their steamboat. This is a cool one. This is the Porter. This is what you would have seen going from Grand Rapids up to Lyons. They could actually even get up to Maple, up to the rapids on the Maple. So for our ancestors, this is what they maybe rode on, and this is what they would ship out in. 1950s. The 1950s, we start to see the birth of the railroad, and the passenger cars are all wood, 50-foot. Your actual box cars are tiny. They're a lot smaller than that now. You look at the rail cars today, and they're 3 times that. They're narrow, 9 feet wide. You can see 50 to 60 passengers using candles, very, very crude. You'd have a wood or coal stove at one end, not really very good. In 1952, you'll talk about 1852, the Michigan Central is running, and that's like the I-94 corridor. They own that rail line, Detroit to Chicago. You can see how fast they're moving right there. Not very fast, 18 miles an hour. 55 though, something important is they start to use the telegraph for train operations. So the depot managers can signal each other if there's problems, delays, anything happening on the tracks, okay? And of course, looking at our settlements during this time period, we're basically talking pretty crude, lots of wood. This is downtown Grand Rapids at the main corners. And this is an epic print. This is when railroads are just starting. This is downtown Grand Rapids. You can see a lot of flatboats, and those are being used on the rivers as well. The Indians are still on the island, which is now gone. It's filled in. And the plank roads are starting to penetrate into our area, western Michigan. But we also have the Pony Express out west, and this also ties into railroads in that this is connecting our country. So the people here in Portland can communicate to their families that have moved out west. And the Pony Express is epic. It's so Americana. It's rugged. You have those Pony Express guys jumping from one horse to the other. They're all young men. It's hard riding. It's very dangerous. A lot of them will die. Bill Cody becomes probably the most famous of the bunch. Made some amazing things, which most of them aren't true, but they're great legends of the West, you know? And the story goes, though, it only lasted for a short period of time. Like many things in Americana, they're episodes that are so short, but they live within our memory. The key takeaway is the telegraph. The telegraph connects it. We have the east and the west, we can communicate. And again, all the rail lines are putting telegraphs between the stations. It's connecting America, it's connecting our communities, it's connecting families. You can send a message to families. In 1858, just before the Civil War, the Detroit and Milwaukee, some of you might remember the Grand Trunk north of here, they reached Grand Rapids going through Saranac and Ionia just before the Civil War. July 4th, the first train arrives in Grand Rapids. Very, very, very special event, historical. And by August 26th, they're out to the Grand River, all the way up to Spring Lake. The railroad growth continues. This is what the Grand Rapids looks like at the Civil War. This is downtown. Today, if you're going to Grand Rapids, this would be Leonard and Plainfield, north side of town. You can still see the lay of the train tracks still have that same lay. They're on the same beds. It's pretty cool. By September, they got all the way out to Spring Lake, as I said. They're building a line across the river, and by that fall, they're into Grand Haven. And that opens up shipping across the lakes with ferries. They can actually move goods and people from rail from Detroit to the lake and then across to Milwaukee. It's redefining transportation here in the Great Lakes. 1860 again, look at how big Grand Rapids is. And of course, this is very early in Portland. Most of our towns are very, very small. There's no lines north, south. The only rail line to Grand Rapids is, again, right through north of us on the Detroit and Main Line. 1850, you got 9,000 miles of railroad in the entire United States, but it's exploding going into the Civil War. You got 30,000 miles, most of it in the north, and it's a big part of why the North will win the Civil War. 59, Thomas Edison is working on one of the railroads. He's just a newsboy, and there's a lot of guys that's, you know, the railroads are a major employer. And the Detroit, Milwaukee, they become the first lumber railroad. We start lumbering on Cockery Creek. That's over in Ottawa County, the other side of Grand Rapids. It's the birth of the wood industry. That's why Grand Rapids becomes the furniture city. Michigan only has 700 miles of track at this time. And just at the start of the Civil War in 1861, they set out the first smoking car, kind of as a deluxe, consumer-friendly place to go and smoke your cigars. And in the Michigan Central line here in Michigan, Michigan led the railroad industry. Michigan Central out of Detroit, Michigan Central puts out the first sleeping car. So they have better facilities to sleep while you're transporting. And the Civil War, of course, is so much part of our community. And why do I show these? Well, of course, I got to show George Custer because my family fought with George Custer. And the important thing is that when they left for the war, they went by rail. And I'm sure for almost 100% of them, it's the first time they've ever been on a railroad car. And they were shipped out of Michigan down to Washington, D.C. Would have been an epic adventure. 1862, while the war's going, they start sorting mail in the railroad cars between towns. And we start to move mail from city to city. This will touch Portland. This touches your depot. 64, Edison's moved on to a telegraph operator, and he's working here in Michigan. And by the end of the year, the Grand Rapids is starting to put a line in north, but it only goes from Grand Rapids to Cedar Springs, just that small distance. But the railroads are growing. Transcontinental Railroad is a big part of building this. And when we talk about Portland, it's not that you just had a railroad depot. What would you do with it? Where would you go? Where could you visit? This is all part of this giant spider web that Portland becomes part of. But they couldn't do it during the Civil War. There's too much disruption. Financing was a problem. But at the end of the Civil War, they get really serious. And by 1869, the lines meet in Utah in this famous print of the Golden Spike. You can actually cross the country now by rail. But still in Michigan, we have a lot of places with no rail. You can see how the miles have grown. 52,000 miles of railroad by 1870. The railroads are exploding. Everyone is, and all these companies, there's all these different companies, and they're raising bonds and trying to get the money to to buy the land rights, and then they got to hire crews to do the landscaping, to put the beds in, and then to lay the rails. Takes a lot of money. And for every company that makes it, there's like 4 or 5 that don't. And there's a lot of, you know, farmers that will invest in this, and they talk about their money is out buried in the field because that roadbed never happened, you know. But that's part of it. 1880, you can see 93,000. So the railroads are growing. This is kind of a neat story. 68, William Davis, again here in Michigan, a Detroit fish dealer. He invents the refrigerator car. And they used to have little doors on the tops of the cars. They could open those up, and there's ice boxes where they would drop ice in at the top. That would keep it chilled so they could send produce to town. How does that affect Portland? You could take your produce, put it on a refrigerator car, and ship it to Detroit and Chicago. Farmers have a revenue. Better market, more money. Locally here we have a company called the Ionia and Lansing Railroad. They start construction of a line out of Lansing into Grand Ledge up to Portland, the plan to go into Ionia. So you're starting to get on the railroad map. It's 1868. 69, that line's going to open for business. And George Westinghouse, another inventor, he invents air brakes for the locomotives, so an important step. Here's a shot out of Portland. One of your local residents that cut ice and would sell it. This is an important business for our communities too, because they would have ice houses along the railroad tracks in different towns, and they would sell the ice to the railroad people. So again, it's more money. The railroad brings commerce, it brings wealth into the community. Neat historical pictures. This is off your calendars that the groups published in the past. With that railroad coming in 69, downtown looks a little different. You end up with that wonderful trestle across the looking glass. I like these epic shots they used to do. The railroad arrived in Portland, and you can see the train coming in, crossing the river, the big trestle, and then downtown, and across the Grand River. So it's a boom. With it, it opens up business for the community. So at this point now, Michigan's up to 1,700 miles of track. So you can see it's railroad crazy. That little Ionia and Lansing Railroad, names get changed because they go kaput, they go bankrupt, they get swallowed up, more funding comes in. So the names change. So when you talk about Portland and the railroad, you hear a lot of people use different names, and it can get a little confusing because these corporations all change. It becomes the Detroit, Lansing, Lake Michigan. And they're going from Ionia. They now start to build spur up into Orleans, Kidville, which is the edge of Belding, all the way into Greenville now. And they do have a small spur that heads into Belding, but it looks more like a streetcar. They don't have a locomotive. You get off the train, get on the little car, and they would horse you into Belding. So again, if you had family in Portland, or Portland has it, and you had a big family get-together, family reunion, this is maybe the way they're coming to Portland out of Belding. That local railroad continued the line from Greenville, and they're moving north. They're going all the way up to Howard. Well, they'll hit that line coming out of Grand Rapids, headed to Mackinac. Becomes a big part of the lumber industry. By 72, Michigan farmers are organizing the Grange, and this is a big part of your community, all the farm communities. The Grange is a movement of the farm. It's an ag group. They come together for social. Saturday night events are a big part of the community. There's no TV and internet, so if you want to see your neighbors, you get together at the Grange. They also become the leading lobbyists for railroad. And if you've ever watched the Laura Ingalls and her Little House on the Prairies, Charles gets real involved in the Grange. He goes to the state convention. They do a good job of explaining the Grange and what they're for. Big part of Americana, a big part of every small town. This is the Grange Hall. It still stands where I live. And it's been remodeled a little bit, but it still has that look. Upstairs was always the lodge meeting place. They would rent the downstairs a lot of times to local merchants. During this time, you have a lot of things happening that affects the railroad in Portland. In '55, John Deere's putting together a steel blade for a plow. Makes a big difference. McCormick's putting together reapers. Big deal for farmers because everything's done in teams and it takes a lot of manpower. And after the Civil War, you have a lot of men that don't come home. Dads are gone, sons are gone. A lot of them are coming home, but they've got amputees. That's what my family lived with. You know, lose a leg, lose an arm. It's hard to work on the farm. So mechanized machinery became real important. And Philip Armour opens up the first plant in Chicago. This is the birth of the Chicago meatpacking industry, and you guys will have stockyards, you'll ship freight. Where are you shipping it? A lot of it's going to be going to Chicago, where they're doing meatpacking. You see these big equipments. This is a thrashing machine. How would that get to Portland? You pick it up at the depot. It's coming in on the rails. This is Powamo Depot, and again, it's just another example of your local depots. And this is also the elevator. All our small towns would have elevators where you would sell your grain, your oats, all your products. Why is that important? Before the birth of the railroad coming to Portland, you'd have to hire a wagon guy to haul your products to market. In the very early days, that means they're hauling that to probably Kalamazoo, Railhead, or they're even going all the way to Detroit. And by the time you do that, you're going to get the market price of wheat that day, but you got to pay that freighter the cost to get it there. So you lose some of your margin, you lose some of your profit. So with the birth of the railroad coming to Portland and that elevator, you're getting market price now, and the money's going to be at your bank tomorrow if you get the draft from the railroad. So that's a big deal for the farmers because your profit margin went up, your wealth went up. You see it when you walk through any of our hometown cemeteries. And you look at the farmers from the 1880s, 1890s, they have the biggest markers in the cemetery. Because they had money. Farming, they did pretty good. And my family's farmers, so I'm not making fun of farmers. They worked hard. Real McCoy, you hear that expression? He was a black inventor here in Ypsilanti, again, Michigan leading the industry, but they're always putting oilers. Every time a locomotive stops, you see the guys out and they had oilers, and they're oiling all the parts because all these parts move, and you got to make sure to reduce friction and heat. He developed an automatic oiler. Nobody could touch it. Nobody could match it. His was the best, and it became the phrase, the real McCoy. It started here in Michigan. Here in Ionia, this is a big event for Portland, too. Your local railroad, they're opening a north line now out of Ionia, so to go through Stanton Junction up to Shiloh, all the way into Stanton. And these locomotives are still burning wood. Some coal, but wood's still the predominant. Why is this important? Is if you're a farmer and you're on the line, you could cut wood, stack it out there, and sell it to the locomotive when he's coming by. They could get a load of wood from you, and that's more money in your pocket. And the thing about it is, it's hard currency. It's not barter. You got hard money. Hard money is important because you need it to pay your taxes to the government. You need it to buy certain things that you can't trade for. So selling wood to the railroad here in Portland, that's a big part of life. Panic of 1873 really hits Michigan hard, as these recessions always do. Stagecoach business, they're pretty much gone by now. And you can see Michigan has grown tremendously, 1,300 locomotives with 30,000 rail cars. So we're in the railroad business in a very short period of time. Here's Ionia County. Let me try using my little... Here's Portland, and you can see how the rail line kind of follows all the way through here. Here's the rail line coming into Ionia. It follows the river line. Saranac all the way over into Kent County. So, and again, you see the line here that goes up into Greenville, through Belding, and then also up to Stanton. So our communities are getting connected. Portland's connected to the rest of the area. You could take the train into the county seat if you needed to do business at the county clerk's office. Ionia becomes a major port, and a lot of people have forgot this too. In '74, the Detroit, Lansing, and Northern, which it's now called, opens up shops, and that becomes kind of their main headquarters. They have their roundhouse where they put all their locomotives to maintenance, their blacksmith shop, machine shops, and that year they start to build car shops, and this is where they're going to construct cars. They're actually going to build them. They employ 200 men. Looking back in the census records, this is the largest employer in Ionia County, is the rail shops. 75, we were up to 752 railroad stations in the state. We have 35 railroad companies just in Michigan, almost 15,000 employees. So again, it becomes one of the biggest employers. You know, just like today, you might work for the car companies. Back then, you worked for the railroads. The Detroit and Milwaukee, that's the line that goes north of us here. In 75, they've got 34 locomotives, 39 passenger cars. They have 189 miles between Grand Haven and Detroit that they're traveling. They have 35 stations on that line. So they're carrying 1,000 passengers a day. This is a big part, too, of the story of the railroad. Portland, if you go back through your records, a lot of times you'll find pictures, and you can actually search out the guys that were on the crew. The census records will identify who was the section hands. And these guys are important. They do all the maintenance, fix the ties. If you have a loose, tie, they have to fix that. You see the shovels here, and it's a winter set. They have to keep the ice off the rails, especially where they have switches. When you have a siding for industry, if there's a siding to come into the elevator here in town, the co-op, they got to make sure that doesn't ice up so that the train can use that. So they're out working in the cold. Rough June. This is their little hand car, pumping along, right out of the movies, but it's real. It's here in Portland. 75, the Pullman Company, new company, they invent the parlor car. This is headquartered again in Detroit. Michigan's leading the railroad industry in the country. With finance companies, our local railroad goes defunct. They change their name. New money comes in. Detroit, Lansing, and Northern is now what the Portland Railroad is going to be called. And it's the DL&N. And they built more shops in Ionia. Ionia is becoming a powerhouse. This is the scene of what Ionia was back then. It blows your mind. Ionia was a huge manufacturing site, major railroad site. These are the railroad cars where they would construct their box cars, their passenger cars, state-of-the-art. Some of the finest in America were built here in Ionia County. Here's another shot of the big project. You see, these are all storage units. They have a round table. They have a roundhouse for locomotives. You see the two larger construction buildings. All this is gone, but one small building remains. Shay, you might have heard of him. He's another Ionia man. He was a lumberman over around Saranac, Boston. Had a small sawmill on his farm. He ends up headed north. One of the problems the locomotives had is that they're big wheels for power to the back, and they can spin because they don't have enough weight on them. So he invented a locomotive with wheels on the front and the back. It's called the Shay Locomotive. Again, Ionia County. He invented this for Michigan logging and mining. And it has so much weight, and it's got traction on both. It's like four-wheel drive in your Buick. You're not going to spin your wheels. So this guy can pull a lot, and it can do tight turns. So they use these in lumbering. They use this in the mines of Michigan. This will end up going out west. You'll see it in the mines out there. You see it in the Oregon, Washington, Canadian lumber business. These guys become big. This is one that was on display up in Cadillac. It's still up there. And 78, again, they're still moving. Stanton now is connected to Edmore. So again, you get on that train here at Portland, you can now go to Edmore. So it's amazing. Over by Ionia, past the prison, they have that big hill. And if you're coming along the river grade, it was always a tough thing. So they hired prison workers, and they had prison workers out there at 60 cents a day. And they hand dug the grade so that it wasn't as steep for the trains to go up. So when you're driving around Ionia, you see these things, you're seeing railroad history. Downtown Grand Rapids, in 30 years, we went from all those wooden shacks that looks like downtown Portland. You got the 1980s look, 2-, 3-story brick buildings. Bigger towns actually have those horse-drawn streetcars. Things are changing. In Portland, it's changing too. Look at how your downtown is starting to develop. Important is that all your retailers here on Main Street, they're selling finished goods. They're not selling flour by the scoop anymore. You're starting to see packaged goods come in. How do they get here? They're coming in by rail. The retailer's picking them up at the depot. And I have handouts of this for everybody. After one per household, I've got, I think, 15 sets of these. This is just kind of an interesting takeaway, but for 1879, what does this mean here locally? And these are the two stations I can get deal details on. But for the Detroit Grand Haven, again later, what we know it maybe as the Grand Trunk, east-west line, this is the shipments that they did here. You can see 448 barrels of flour were shipped out. Salt, apples, 1,500, 10,000 pounds of grain, 250,000 pounds of wool, 244 tons of all kinds of freight, 250 tons of brick. They had a lot of brick in the quarry business, the other side of Ionia. Here again, this is your station, Detroit, Lansing, and Northern, connecting to Portland. These are goods that you'd be seeing go by on the freight cars, part of them coming here to unload. You can see almost 4 million pounds of merchandise, produce. Again, we talk about livestock, 1 million pounds of animals, cattle and pigs, plaster, stone, manufactured article. You're seeing the birth of manufacturing. So when you make something, can you get it to market? Can we ship it to Chicago? Can we get it to Detroit? Yes, we can. This is my humor. Portland, people say it's a cow town. I know they say that about my hometown, but I always think it's funny. But anyway, this is a great picture from your calendar. And this is really not a joke because the railroads also have accidents and people get hurt. This is an accident. It's on one of your calendars, October 14, 1917. They say it's Pierre Marquette because the railroad it changed its name by then, but you can see the wrecked cars here, the wood, they're using wood. It's totally shattered. You can see it was carrying a load of livestock, which is dead in the street. Over here on the corner, you see the rail where the guys are standing. So the train derailed, totally crashed. Really a sad thing. Another picture of Portland, and this is that transition. We think of things as linear. I'm talking linear through the timeline, but there's also the circle of life. And this is true of Portland, it's true in Climax-Scotts. If you study any hometown, and you know, I know how small towns are with my family history. This talks about Rice coming to town as the school teacher, and one of his students is Mary Newman, the first family. She was the first one born here. They get to know each other, and they end up getting married and having a farm on the Looking Glass. And how it comes full circle is they'll sell the farm, he comes back into town, and he buys an interest in the Newman mill, the flour mill. So you have the Newman rice. So it's full circle from the first family that comes on those Indian trails to we're back to the railroads, we're selling flour, we're shipping goods. All in one generation. Michigan's growing. You can see how the rails grow. The Shay locomotives are becoming world famous. They're all over the world. Steam heat is introduced into passenger cars in 1880. So that little pot-belly stove, you can stay a little bit warmer when you're in those parlor cars. And right here in Michigan, down toward my hometown area, they receive a patent for the locomotive headlight. So in 1881, you're starting to put headlights on those locomotives. 83, the railroads are trying to coordinate times, and every town sets their time on high noon based on the sun. That doesn't work well when you're running a railroad. So they developed 4 standard time zones across the country. We know it. We think it's been here forever. The railroads is what did it. The railroads brought standard time to Portland. And that becomes part of it. This is the Woodbury. This is over by Lake Odessa. This is right on the edge of Ionia County where the line out of Hastings dead-ended, and they kind of had a depot for both lines. They start to publish schedules with the time zone. Now that we know what the times are, so every town is listed, what time it's going to come in, what time it leaves, the morning one, the late one, so you could go to the depot and you knew when to expect the freight to come in. Or if you had family coming to town, you knew what time you had to have the buggy down there to pick them up. So it was an important thing. Throughout this period, logging is booming. And this is true for the Grand, the Looking Glass, all the rivers. We're cutting trees like crazy. And this shows you what a log boom looks like when they're hitting downriver. We have the river rats that are moving these logs. And what downtown would look like with all the logs as they're going through Grand Rapids. The railroads are continuing to build, and in '87 something happens that affects you guys in Portland, and that they build a line from Grand Ledge, and they're trying to get into Grand Rapids because of the market. So they go through Sunfield, Lake Odessa, Clarksville, Elmdale, into Grand Rapids. They're cutting the corner. It puts that rail company into Grand Rapids, which is becoming a manufacturing hub for Michigan. It's important for their business. By '87, the logging business has peaked and going down, and they had to make a change to survive. Mackinac Island, the same year something happens, they built the Grand Hotel, something that you're familiar with. 600 rooms, it's a resort. It's built by the railroads for tourism. Logging's going down, what are we going to do? We'll become a tourist thing. We'll try to talk people to go on vacation. So the railroads build that. Another local, Lowell and Hastings, builds a railroad. It's going to connect Lowell to Hastings. The hood is it doesn't touch either city for the first few years. It's just a little strip of railroad. But anyway, Lake Odessa, they had the Witch Tower, which still stands in Lake Odessa, here in Ionia, Clarksville. And again, you can see how the maps change. This line is the only rail line that's left to touch Ionia. Everything else is now gone. This is what my hometown rail line, again, coming from through Ionia. And again, I talked about goods coming to market. This is a great shot of one of your local factories. Shows the women working in the factory, making wood furniture. They're making a lot more than the farmers here in Portland are ever going to use. So this is going to be exported. They can get that down to the depot, get it on a freight car, ship it down to Detroit, ship it to Chicago. And again, we're talking about the period of '72, Chicago burns down. They're buying wood products like crazy. That's fine. We're sending them raw wood, we're sending them finished goods, we're sending them furniture, all that kind of stuff. This is a wild thing, but it's true. Railroad brings the circus to town. This is a time when you're on the farm, it's kind of a black and gray world, and the circus is exciting. It's a glimpse of the world that you don't normally see. And this is Wild Bill, Buffalo Bill Circus going down the street after they unloaded promotional before the circus started. Buffalo Bill wasn't here, so why do I talk about it? Well, you had a lot of circuses traveling. A lot of them small, some of them big. They moved by rail. All the rail cars were like billboards of advertising, brightly painted. They're gonna, if a rail car's moving from the Lansing show to Ionia Fairgrounds, they're coming through Portland. So if you read your newspapers, you might not find the circus was here. But if you look in the county paper, you might see the circus was in Ionia. That tells you that the boys and the girls were down at the depot watching the circus train go by. So it's a neat little part of history. By '88, the lumber, again, I said, has peaked. That's going down. And in 1890, we think of this as being a part of the Old West. Michigan doesn't have those cattle guards on the front of the locomotives until almost 1890. Panic of '93 is another major thing. Business is horrible. It's hard for the railroads. They finally, in '95, it's been required by law that you have to have a poster up for your citizens so they know when the rails are coming. But the whoop was at the door. It was a very hard time for farmers. It's a hard time for industry. Factories are shut down. This happened here in Michigan. All our towns, I mean, you could not sell anything. It was called the Great Depression of that generation. We think of the Great Depression as the 30s. Previous people, 93, 94, 95 was horrible. Factory workers had no employment. Another talk for another day is the story of Oz. What was Frank Baum trying to tell us? The Tin Man is the factory worker that doesn't have a heart for the farmers. Agriculture, the Grange movement becomes really powerful during this period of time. And the things they're looking at is forming co-ops. You know that word in Portland because you develop a co-op to cut out the middleman. The farmers buy everything direct so that they don't have to pay the middleman. Things are hard. So if you can cut out the middleman, your money goes a little farther, you can get the things you need on your farm. They're pushing for more silver coinage. They want idle workers to do public works to improve our communities. We saw that in the Depression as well. They want to nationalize the railroads because the railroad guys are making huge profits. We're talking about the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and J.P. Morgan, all these people. And they also want rural delivery. And this is something they push for, and it happens really, really fast. And that makes a big difference to the farmer, that you can get things. You start to see the birth of the catalogs, the Sears catalog, Montgomery Ward. You now can order it and it'll be shipped to your farm. So one of my phrases around my family, I joke all the time, I say this daily, is it's the same but different. So today we have Amazon, it's the same but different. They had it on the farm too. And also they push for the graduated taxes. So the scarecrow in the Wizard of Oz is the farmers. Right? He's got a lot of common sense wisdom, but he doesn't have the degree and he questions himself, just as the scarecrow does. 98 blizzard, you know, the blizzards here in Michigan could shut the railroads down. For the Pierre Marquette that we're talking about here, by 1898, trains are shut down for 5 days. They had to plow all these rails out. It shuts business down, all the travel. By 1899, things are changing. Olds opens up their first auto factory. That's going to have a big effect on the railroads. January 1st, something really big happens. You have 3 major railroads that are in dire shape after the 1890s. They merge. That includes our local railroad, the Detroit Lansing Northern. These 3 companies from Western Michigan, Eastern Michigan, and Central Michigan form what's called the Pierre Marquette. And that's the name many times we hear about our railroads, Pierre Marquette. So it's the same rail line, same depot, corporation names change. But the Pierre Marquette becomes the largest railroad operator in Michigan. They're really dominant. Another really cool thing is 1900. The trains come to the house. Lionel starts to make trains, Christmas trains. You come to the local store, you might see it in a showroom at the local general store here in Portland. There are accidents. In 1893, 18 people died on Pierre Marquette here, and it's just into Kent County coming across from Ionia. So it is dangerous. By 05, 1,776 depots. Everywhere there's a depot. Everybody's connected. By 06, you're starting to see steel passenger cars. Things are starting to happen. Pierre Marquette, again, the largest railroad operator, and you're part of it, 2,300 miles of track here in Michigan. And in 07, the car business hasn't really been born yet, but the railroad business is the car business at that time. Detroit's making a lot of cars, box cars, the Pullman company making cars all over the country. They're employing 9,000 people. It's a big deal. In 1809, Ionia builds the new Grand Trunk. That building has, that depot is one of the few still standing. I think it's a, is it a community center now? I don't know. It's right down by town.
There's some private businesses there.
Yeah, is it a business? Yeah. The building's still standing.
What was the thing about the 1910, what was about the horses?
Oh, I'm sorry. 1910, horses were used as late on Michigan Central for some of their logging branches. So they would use horse teams to get the logs on rails to get them to the main line, then load them up to send them to the market. This is interesting. You're seeing this change really fast. In 1916, railroads are doing 98% of the traffic between cities, 77% of the freight. So even as late as 16, the railroads are dominant here. But we also have 5 million automobiles. Things are starting to change, and they change so fast. 1918, the entire country now goes on the railroad clock, standard time zones. Homecoming. Again, we don't think about this, but homecoming isn't what it used to be. Family reunions aren't, but it was a big deal at one time because people would disperse, they would move to different cities for work, they would marry and move. Homecoming was coming home, and you'd come in at the depot, and your family would come pick you up. So again, 98% of the people moving are moving by rail. So when you had your homecoming, the railroads, you can read in the old newspaper accounts, these railroads would be packed when you had homecoming because everybody's coming back to town. We don't think about this, but as business starts to go down, the Pierre Marquette starts to market themselves. And as they're the biggest northern railroad, they start putting sporting goods trips together. You could do fishing trips where you could catch the train on a Friday, you could go up north, they drop you off, pick you up Sunday, and bring you back. So you could actually go on a fishing trip. So sports starts to enter the railroad business. 1920, the depot in Stanton, which is Pierre Marquette now, we're starting to lose businesses. And in 23, all that great complex of brick shops in Ionia is starting to get shut down. And then by 27, they're starting to shut down some of these small branches, and they're mixed trains, which is freight and passenger together because they're small towns, there's not a lot of business. Those are starting to go away. By 28, they're starting to put trusses and things. They're starting to modernize their cars. The old all-wooden Wild West cars are starting to go away. Big deal is 29 for railroads. The stock market crash is going to have a devastating effect. Also in 29, you can see the buses are starting to show up. 15% of your traffic is now buses. Trucks are starting to show up. Also in 29, with the crash, Pierre Marquette it rolls over as a corporation. So we see the birth of the Chesapeake and Ohio. They come in and buy it up. So you'll see the C&O name here in Portland, and you look at the old papers. Again, you're starting to see modernization of the passenger cars. They're starting to abandon lines. Ionia north to Stanton, that line's closed down. They abandoned the line over on the border of Ionia with Elmdale. That line's closed down. And by 36, all those brick buildings and all that beautiful complex in Ionia, it's all been torn down. This is the last one. I took this picture, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, and I saw it about a year ago. It looks so much worse. It might not even be around much longer. Last of Ionia railway history. 38, this is kind of cool. The DC-3, the airliner business, starts to have a little bit of an impact, and it'll eventually just destroy the railroads. Pierre Marquette still struggling. Ionia to Orleans, that line's starting to go down. They closed that down. The line from Howard City to Greenville by 42, in the middle of World War II, which is surprising. We're closing railroads during the war. And by 46, with the birth of the airliners, the old black porter that we used to see on the railroad is starting to be replaced. They have to compete with airline stewardesses. So the Pierre Marquette's one of the leaders in the country on this. They hire attractive young women. They put them in a special uniform. They're not allowed to have makeup. and they become kind of your train stewardesses. And they relaunch their whole line for fancy locomotives that look modern and sleek. So this is what's crisscrossing Michigan if you're in Portland right at the end of World War II. Whole new look. And again, by 47, it's now the C&O. By 50, the last steam engines are starting to fade. Everything now is diesel. And by 55, the last Grand Trunk line north of us here, that's coming out of Grand Haven. That business is changing. Everything's shutting down. 56, the Detroit streetcars closed because of the car business. There's not enough usage on that. So 57, the last logging branch is going down. So after World War II, drastic change is starting to take place as people are moving to air for the first time over railroads. By 60, the last steam-powered passenger train is right here in Michigan, and that's the last regular run. Michigan's logging business is officially ended by 64. That was just a little bit of activity in the Upper Peninsula. And in 1966, Penn Central Railroad is formed with a merger of the New York Central. The railroads are starting to have financial problems and the government's involved. There's a lot of pension money. This gets into pension rating that's taking place here because there's so much money, so many employees. But they start to form. And this is kind of cool. That same year, which most of us could maybe remember 66, the old catwalks on the top of the boxcars that they used during the Wild West days, those are being removed. And by 74, they're illegal. And instead of having the brake wheel up on top, they move the brake wheel down low, so it's more accessible. So it's a little thing, but it kind of changes the looks of our boxcars. By 1970, I'm in high school, just getting ready to graduate. Penn Central is now in bankruptcy, ends really bad. And passenger service is kaput in the entire country. We have the birth of what's Amtrak. The government puts together a system. And by 73, there's 21 railroads in Michigan that they want to abandon. And it's 1,260 miles of track, about a third. So and we've already closed a lot of tracks. You can see after World War II, things go south really fast. 74, Grand Trunk closes that modern station in Ionia. In 75, Alto in my area, Belding closes in Ionia. This is a picture of one of the Chesapeake's big powerhouse locomotives being retired. 76, Ford consolidates everything into Conrail now, so you have one freight company. And the freight house in Ionia, the last bit of it, which was used for freight, that's now gone too. This is an example of one of the freight houses that used to be in Ionia. You might remember that before 80. C&O is now the CSX. They now are getting rid of the line from Grand Ledge through Portland into Ionia. As a business, factory production is down in Ionia. As the factories go down, freight goes down, the railroad goes down. It's a domino effect. So it cost Portland your rail line. They remodeled the Shay up at Cadillac, so it looks a little bit better. This is the little way station at Lyons. They had a little spur that you had to pull in and then back out to the main line. If you were going from Portland to Ionia, you might be riding, you'd have to make a stop to pick up people. This is the Pierre Marquette 1225. This is another one of those big, super Berkshire locomotives. These are some of the most powerful locomotives ever made. They use these a lot in Pennsylvania in the coal industry. This one's famous. It's been restored in the Owasso at the rail fan club up there. It is known now as the Polar Express. So again, you're part of this Pierre Marquette system in Portland. You share in them. This is part of the Pierre Marquette system, the Polar Express. 87, CSX sells track into Greenville. Again, we're just shrinking. The lines are going away. And in 2008, June 24th, the last train pulls out of Ionia. And after that's pulled out, they're doing a little bit of business with the farm supply. They pulled the rails, and Ionia went from no rails to having a lot of rails to being a rail center to being out of the railroad business. It happened fast. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm not part of the story. This is your story, and hopefully I helped you to understand your community a little bit and share some of the love of what the railroads meant to the generations before. You know, It's important that we tell those stories because the rail line's gone. When I'm driving around the community, you can still see the rail bed in many places. And the younger generation might not realize that. But it's a great story to talk about Indian trails and then the birth of the rails. And again, that little wooden building that we started with, it was just a little wooden building. It was at the depot. It was the center of town. It was the center of people's lives. It was the center of business. So it's appropriate, I think, that you're rebuilding it to be a community center because it could be the community center again. So thank you very much for coming tonight.
So with that being said, we have a rich history in our railroad depot and our growth in Portland, and I'd like to thank John for coming out here and